Today we'll take a look at every unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game. Games that did not make it past the concept stage will not be discussed. Any game that has a known prototype that has been dumped will not be discussed, like Beethovens 2nd or the Swamp Thing for example. Finally, no Sega Activator Pack-In games or Sega VR games on the list. That being said, we have 45 unreleased titles to check out, so let's get into the video. Madness House of Fun is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive platformer that began development in 1993 by Gremlin Graphics. This game was supposedly based on the English ska band Madness, and the title may have been further influenced by their #1 hit song, House of Fun. Madness House of Fun was to be a remake of the Amiga game called Harlequin, released a year earlier by Gremlin Graphics, featuring a total of 14 levels. Madness House of Fun would have began development on the Sega Mega Drive as Harlequin, until Gremlin acquired the Madness licensing, and although the game didn't seem to feature any Madness band members, the main character, Mr. Smash, may have been based on the band's trumpet player, Chaz Smash. This game was to be released sometime in 1994, but was likely cancelled in 1994 as well. Sadly, even though Madness House of Fun was nearly complete, we only have a couple magazine references to go off of, and no prototype has been found. Halloween Capsule is an unreleased Sega Mega Drive beat-em-up game that began development by Softmax in late 1993 or early 1994. This game would have been a side-scroller style brawler with anthropomorphic characters. As the story goes, a mad scientist has turned the entire population into animal-human hybrids, and it is now up to the cat, dog, and duck to defeat the mad scientist and save the world. Animations and character sprites seem to have some work put into them, although we only ever see one level background in the few Korean magazine articles that covered it. Halloween Capsule made decent progress during its supposed year-long development cycle, but was ultimately cancelled sometime late in 1994 when Softmax decided to get out of the home video game console market. No prototype has been found. Interplanetary Lizards of the Texas Plains is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive action game played with an isometric view, developed by Alexandria and published by Tengen. The game was based on the 90s comic book series of the same name and made its first appearance at Winter CES 1993. Interplanetary Lizards of the Texas Plains was planned to be released in late 1993, pushed back to 94, and then ultimately cancelled for unknown reasons. We can see a couple Sega magazine references to the game around the same time it was being developed, but this is the last we would hear of Interplanetary Lizards of the Texas Plains until 2014. A prototype of the game was discovered on September 19, 2014 in Connecticut. The buyer made a Facebook post that same day and said, quote, "The game was unfinished and that they will upload videos of the game soon." I haven't been able to find any actual footage of the prototype in action, only a few screenshot images found online. So as for now, the prototype is found, but ROM has not been dumped, and we're unsure if or when the owner plans on doing so. Mutant Speed Demons is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game developed by New Wave Graphics and likely to be published by EA in 1993. Development of the game started in 1993, and it would be produced by the same person that brought us fan favorites like Mutant League Football and hockey, Michael Mentheim. But only one magazine article in GamePro magazine, and Mutant Speed Demons was gone forever. It's unclear how far development had gone on for and the game was unreleased, but the years after its cancellation, more info began to appear. A prototype of the game was found in 2009, although the batteries powering the cartridge had long been dead, and the information on the board subsequently wiped. Later in 2011, a 100 to 200 page manuscript of the game was sold at auction, and some of the pages were scanned and posted online, although the entire manuscript has never been digitally archived. In 2021, some artwork from the game was discovered on an old version of Mike Kennedy's website, the artist that worked on the Mutant Speed Demons project. As you can see, there are a bunch of sprites and pages from the manuscript that document what could have been. Plenty of characters and game modes to choose from, and Mike Kennedy described it as, quote, Road Rash but with extra features that Road Rash didn't have at the time, including hills and projectile weapons. The game was violent like Mutant League was, but cartoony with green blood and explosions. There's a ton of info on GamesThatWeren't.com, and I'll leave a link in the video description. Beatforce is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed and published in 1992 by Sammy. Only one article and screenshot have been found about the game from Joypad magazine in March 1993. SegaRetro.org describes the gameplay in Beatforce as a shoot-'em-up, while Unseen64.net says it's a hack and slash. The single screenshot provided reminds me of something like Final Zone or Viewpoint on the Genesis. The magazine article describes Beatforce as a kind of futuristic gauntlet in which you play the role of an overarmed gladiator. While the action is viewed from above, the screen moves in a multi-directional scrolling with an excellent effect. Beatforce was likely cancelled sometime in mid to late 1993 for unknown reasons. No prototype has been found. Deep Scanner is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game, also being developed and published by Sammy in 1992. This is the only article found based on this game, and was paired with Beatforce on the opposite page in the same issue of Joypad magazine in March 1993. Deep Scanner was an action game, and this is how it was described in the magazine article. Armed with a laser gun and other weapons you may find during your peripeties through bonus areas, halfway between Rolling Thunder and Double Dragon, Deep Scanner will allow you to freely choose between a half dozen levels, each ending with a final boss monster. You have to be quick because time is limited and enemies don't wait to jump on you. Deep Scanner was also likely cancelled in mid to late 1993 for unknown reasons, and no prototype has been found. Nitro Rex is an unreleased Sega Genesis game, likely developed by Zyrinx and published by Scavenger. Development would have began in 1994 and ended sometime in 1995. Gameplay was said to be something like Road Rash meets Outrun, but with monster trucks. Sometime in 1995, development shifted from Nitro Rex, and this project was turned into heavy machinery for the Sega 32X console, which was ultimately scrapped as well shortly after. In 2021, a video surfaced taken from an old VHS tape showcasing some upcoming 32X titles. Here we catch a glimpse of what Nitro Rex or Heavy Machinery may have looked like. Although there seems to be some info on both of these projects, an alleged push to get Heavy Machinery on the Sega Saturn, and footage found on a VHS tape, you would think there's a possibility a prototype would turn up soon. For now, this is all the info I have, and a prototype is yet to be found. Pit Fighter 2 is an unreleased fighting game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Developed by Polygames and set to be published by Tengen in October of 1993. It's a sequel to the original Pit Fighter arcade game and features a new list of characters, each with their own special moves. It's a fun mix between wrestling and fighting with its own unique mechanics. Characters from the original Pit Fighter would return, and a few from the second Pit Fighter on arcade would also make an appearance. Pit Fighter 2 was shown off at both Summer and Winter CES 1993 and had a handful of gaming magazine articles, and although it was said to have been nearly complete, it never saw the light of day and was unreleased. No prototype has been found. Home Improvement Power Tool Pursuit is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game which was presented at Winter CES 1993, along with its Super Nintendo counterpart. The Super Nintendo version came out in November 1994, but the Mega Drive version never saw the light of day. It's a platformer starring Tim the Toolman Taylor, based on the sitcom Home Improvement. Slated for release in October 1994, but we're unsure how far along the project was and why it was cancelled. We can speculate it may be due to poor sales on the SNES version, and Genesis coming up on the end of its lifespan. It's unclear who would have developed this project, although Absolute was going to take care of the publishing. All we have to go off is a couple screenshots and release dates from a few gaming magazines, and no prototype has been found. City Heroes is an unreleased Sega Mega Drive beat-em-up game that began development in 1992 by Samsung and was completely finished and bug-free by 1994. It was to be published by Samsung as well, and it even said that City Heroes had a planned overseas release for the Sega Genesis. City Heroes would have been a side-scroller beat-em-up with obvious resemblance to the Streets of Rage series in the graphics and gameplay. Gameplay would have featured 2 playable characters with single-player and co-op options, along with 5 levels in total. Being developed in Korea for the Korean Mega Drive market, Samsung ran into multiple censorship issues, and this was the main reason the game was never released. After this debacle, Samsung decided to stop developing for consoles altogether. Although no gameplay footage has surfaced and it's claimed to have been completely finished, a prototype is yet to be found. Earl Weaver Baseball is an unreleased baseball game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being developed by Mirage Graphics in 1991 and set to be published by EA. The Sega version was a completely different game compared to Earl Weaver Baseball on the computer in 1987. Earl Weaver Baseball was shown at Summer CES 1991 and was mentioned in a couple magazines in the upcoming game section. The game was cancelled sometime in mid-1992, and it's speculated that it may have turned into the Tony La Russa Baseball series, which was released on the Sega Genesis in 1993. On February 12, 2016, a user on the AtariAge.com forum made a post detailing his discovery of an Earl Weaver Baseball prototype cartridge. In short, the story is that the owner used to buy Genesis games while thrifting with his mom. He found this odd-looking proto cartridge one day, brought it home, played it a few times, and moved on to games he was more interested in. Fast forward 20 years later, and he's cleaning out his closet while he takes a closer look at a game which says preliminary version on the sticker. We can see gameplay footage from the prototype cartridge uploaded on September 3rd, 2020 by the owner. But you can see in the video that he will only dump the ROM at 1,000 subscribers. He goes on to explain in detail the entire story and his research, which I'd recommend checking out, and we'll leave the Atari Age forum link in the video description, if you care to do so. The YouTube channel currently has 332 subscribers and 32k views on the prototype video. I'll leave the link in the video description. Maybe we can get that prototype dumped eventually. Keeper of the Gates is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed and published by Razorsoft in 1992. Keeper of the Gates was supposed to be the sequel to the 1991 game Stormlord on the Sega Genesis. This would have been an action game played through 8 levels filled with traps and puzzles. There would be tournament play where up to 6 players could alternate between gameplay to compete and test their skills. It was shown at Winter CES 1992 and titled Stormlord 2 at the time. This project was also referenced in a few gaming magazines around this time, but Keeper of the Gates was cancelled on the Genesis and Mega Drive, but eventually came out as Deliverance in 1993 on the Amiga. Confusing enough already, but Deliverance was also an updated version of the 1990 title Deliverance Stormlord 2, released on the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum. Anyway, no prototype of the original Keeper of the Gates has been found. Jester is an unreleased platformer for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being developed by Sega Technical Institute and set to be published by Sega of America in April of 1994. The game was featured in at least 2 gaming magazines in 1994, and the only ad with a screenshot gives us a brief description of the game. Only a clay character can survive this torture. Saw him in half, shoot him out of a cannon, throw him in lava, Jester will survive. Planned original box art and few backgrounds with very little information are all we know of Jester currently, although it was supposedly nearing completion of its development cycle. No prototype has been found. Mr. Magoo is an unreleased Sega Mega Drive game being developed by Millennium Interactive in 1994. The game was originally planned for release in 1994 for both the Amiga 1200 and the Amiga CD32, but both of these versions were cancelled. During gameplay, you would try to save Mr. Magoo by using objects to trigger events described in a gaming magazine. As a cross between Lemmings and The Incredible Machine, a single article from an Australian gaming magazine, Megazone, was published in August of 1994, showing a few screenshots of Mr. Magoo along with the format stating Mega Drive. From this article, we can assume a Sega Mega Drive version was also in production and cancelled around the same time in 1994. GamesThatWeren't.com posted an article just 4 days ago on March 11, 2025, where one user managed to get in touch with the Amiga developer, Mike Ball, who said, quote, "Unfortunately, I didn't keep anything of the Magoo project. It was one of those projects that never really made it past the demo stage before it was put on ice. That being said, it's likely the Mega Drive version was around the same stage in development as well before it was cancelled. No prototype has been found." Ragnarok is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game which was announced in 1992. It likely began development by Imagitech Design in the same year and would have been published by GameTech. Ragnarok would have been a version of the Amiga and MS-DOS game King's Table: The Legend of Ragnarok, which played like a fantasy board game. A Game Gear version was also rumored to have been in development, and the Mega Drive version was due to be released sometime in mid-1993, but was ultimately cancelled around the same time. It's unclear how far into the development cycle Ragnarok had made it, and no prototype has been found. Battle Mission is an unreleased shooting game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, similar to something like Operation Wolf on the NES. A gaming magazine article describes Battle Mission as taking place during World War II, where the main character is washed ashore on an island in the Pacific. You have to fight enemies to escape and could achieve different game endings depending on how well you played. Renovation would be the publisher for Battle Mission, and we think the developer was Sega. Development began in 1990, but it's said that the game was cancelled only a few months after in the summertime. I'm unsure of the exact reasons for cancellation, and no prototype has been found. Women Sinister Virus is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed by Clockwork Tortoise in 1996 and planned to be published by Sega of America later that same year. Several magazine articles would come out covering Women Sinister Virus throughout 1996 and 1997, and the release date for the game would be pushed back several times all the way to late 1997, near the end of the Sega Genesis lifecycle. A promo video for the game was uploaded to YouTube on March 18, 2008, and we can see that the gameplay seemed to be similar, looking and playing to X-Men 2 Clone Wars. I played through Clone Wars several times back in the day, and you can unlock and play through the game as Magneto at one point. The flying in the promo video reminded me of how Magneto controlled in X-Men 2 Clone Wars. Women was going to be released the same day as X-Men Mojo World on the Game Gear, along with a comic book tie-in, but Clockwork Tortoise went under in early 1997, so this is likely what caused the cancellation. It also seemed fairly far into development cycle, if not complete, and it's unclear why the game never came out. No prototype has been found. Wolfenstein 3D is an unreleased first-person shooter for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being developed by Imagineer in 1994. Around this time, id Software had ported Wolfenstein 3D to the SNES in early 1994, and the Mega Drive version, which would have simply been titled Wolfenstein, was to come out later in the year. When it comes to the Wolfenstein series, I feel it doesn't need much explanation in the gameplay department, and it would have been cool to see another good FPS on the Mega Drive. Wolfenstein on the Mega Drive was pushed back to a 1995 release and was ultimately cancelled sometime in 1994. No prototype has been found. Popeye The Sailor Man is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed by Technos in early 1994. The game is based on the cartoon character Popeye The Sailor Man and has been mentioned in a few video game magazines throughout 1994, including screenshots of some gameplay. Technos showed off all three versions of their Popeye games at Winter CES 1994, Popeye for the Super Famicom, and Popeye Beach Volleyball on the Game Gear. It's even said that the Mega Drive version was playable at the event. The Super Famicom and Game Gear Popeye games did manage to get a release, while Popeye the Sailor Man for Mega Drive was cancelled in the end. On February 25th of this year, a Twitter user posted a video of a Popeye the Sailor Man prototype cartridge for the Mega Drive playing on a Sega Nomad. The video shows the title screen and a mainly unfinished first level before it ends. It's unsure what the owner's intentions are when it comes to dumping the ROM, as we can see in the comments on the post. So for now, the prototype is found, but the ROM remains undumped. Zodiac is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive shoot-'em-up game being developed and also set to be published by Ubisoft in 1992. It was a two-man development team consisting of Frederick Hod, one of the original Rayman designers, and Laurent Cluzel. Zodiac is said to have been completed sometime in 1993. Hod started the development of Zodiac in early 1992, and it took him a year and a half to complete, with the help of Cluzel as, quote, graphic artist, making the engine, coding the tools, alone in my apartment. No internet at this time. As we can see in the video clip, Zodiac is complete and there are known prototypes that exist. The reason Ubisoft decided to can the project is also quoted by Hod in an interview with Arcade Attack when he said, "The game was 100% finished, but Sega Mega Drive began to slow down at the time, and unfortunately Ubisoft decided not to release the game. Only 2 ROMs exist at this time, Laurent's and mine. Maybe someday I will give the Mega Drive emulator scene a copy." And there you have it. 2 prototypes in the hands of the creators, and it seems like they have plans to dump the ROM publicly, eventually. Smartvark is an unreleased action game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Unknown who would be developing this one, but set to be published by Codemasters in 1994. It seems like the base concept of the gameplay seemed similar to Gex. where in Smartvark you'd play as Arnie the Aardvark, TV repairman, traveling channel to channel, repairing the bugs in each TV. Development likely began sometime in 1993 and stopped mid to late 1994. A handful of screenshots and articles can be seen taken from retro gaming magazines throughout 1994, but Smartvark was eventually cancelled for unknown reasons, and no prototype has been found. Cartoon Combat is an unreleased fighting game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being developed by Technos in 1994, and planned to be released in October of the same year. With only a single screenshot to reference from an old gaming magazine, it seems like Cartoon Combat would have been a simple arcade-style fighting game featuring cartoon animal characters. Oddly enough, even with very little info of this game's existence, an Unseen64 user by the name of Mr. Mark managed to find a prototype of the project. I could only find this single picture of the prototype taken from the Unseen64 interview, and it seems that the prototype has been damaged and it's likely we'll never be able to play this copy of the game. So until we find another prototype, this ROM remains undumped. Demon Dinosaurs is an unreleased racing game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being developed and published by Codemasters in 1994. The gameplay is said to be similar to something like Outrun, but featuring dinosaurs and cavemen as the racers. Originally titled Dino Racer, it was set to be released in October of '94, and we can see it being advertised in Mega Console Issue 6 and Megaforce Issue 29. Be sure to scan and upload your retro gaming magazines if you have an issue that hasn't been archived online, as there are still plenty of unreleased games to uncover. For now, no prototype of Demon Dinosaurs has been found. Monster Hunter is an unreleased light gun game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, compatible with the Menacer light gun. Monster Hunter was being developed by Funscape Productions and set to be published by Sega of America in December 1993. The only magazine article on Monster Hunter describes it as, "In Monster Hunter, the story involves the player as a premier big game hunter in search of the ultimate catch. The scenarios range from safari lands to exotic ranges, not from our world." Monster Hunter missed its December 1993 release and was pushed back to January 1994, and was likely cancelled around this time. No prototype of Monster Hunter has been found. Devil Buster is an unreleased action platformer game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being developed by Sims in 1993. It was advertised fairly heavy in a couple Japanese retro gaming magazines, and it seemed well polished graphically. Enemies and levels look good, but without more of an English description, I couldn't say for certain what the gameplay would be comparable to. Devil Buster was to be released in July of 1993, but was cancelled for unknown reasons, and no prototype has been found. Battle Smash is an unreleased action game for the Sega Mega Drive, being developed by Kaneko in 1992. Select your character and face off against bosses in each stage. The graphics look cool, but it apparently played very similar to something like Breakout or Pong, where your weapon is the ball. There may have been more action or RPG elements, but there is very little English information on this title. Not sure on what Kaneko's planned release date was for Battle Smash, or how far into development it was. No Battle Smash prototype has been found. Moon Dancer is an unreleased Sega Mega Drive game that began development in 1989 by Beep in Sega R&D 2. Beep Magazine partnered with Sega to develop Moon Dancer, and it was based on the Japanese magazine series that ran in Beep Magazine of the same name. An Unseen64 page on the game described the gameplay as, quote, "story-based adventure with battles being grid-based strategy, and there were also RPG elements." This project was in development for a total of 6 months before being cancelled, and was to be initially published and released by Sega in March of 1990. No Moon Dancer prototype has been found. Mickey Mania 2 is an unreleased and unannounced Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed by Traveler's Tales. It likely started development a year after the release of the original Mickey Mania in 1995, but isn't known. The only reason we're aware of this game is because of this prototype video footage released by the co-founder of Traveler's Tales, John Burton, back in 2017. According to Sega 16, Mickey Mania would have played, quote, "similar to the first, though would have featured stages based on different Mickey Mouse cartoons, as well as including new mechanics." Mickey Mania 2 was said to have been cancelled in order to focus on the release of Toy Story, but at least this video gives us a look at how it was shaping up to be. Seeing what's here, it seems like Mickey Mania 2 would have looked and played just as well as the first, and it's unclear at this point in time if we will ever see a ROM dump of the game. Roadbusters is an unreleased Sega Mega Drive vertical scrolling action game being developed by Nihon Telenet and to be published by Renovation in November of 1990. This project would have been the spiritual successor to Nihon Telenet's game American Truck for the PC-88 in 1985. During gameplay, you'd control a semi-truck, and it's said to have played similar to Spy Hunter. One double-page ad and a single smaller ad are all we have uncovered of Roadbusters from some old Japanese retro gaming magazines. Roadbusters was likely cancelled in the same year it began production, and no prototype has been found. Beanball Benny is an unreleased action beat-em-up game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being developed by Microsmiths in 1991, and to be published by New Vision Entertainment in the same year. Beanball Benny was described on Unseen64 in an interview with one of its developers as, quote, an original theme, baseball player vigilante goes cruising around the city streets, subways, trying to bean criminals and dodge obstacles. Beanball Benny was shown at Summer CES 1991, but was likely cancelled when New Vision went under shortly thereafter. The footage you've been watching here is from a prototype that was found in March 2010 by a user of the Digital Press forum. He uploaded some screenshots and this gameplay footage, but as of today, the Beanball Benny ROM has not been dumped. Cutie Poo is an unreleased action platformer for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being developed by DMA Design in 1990 with no set publisher or release date. Cutie Poo was developed solely by Tony Colgan of DMA Design, who worked on notable titles such as Lemmings and Grand Theft Auto. You play as the character Bob, exploring a chocolate factory while avoiding traps and saving creatures called Tribbles along the way. Cutie Poo was being developed for both the Amiga and Sega Mega Drive, but neither version came out, and only the Amiga version was demoed at the European Computer Entertainment Show, London, in October of 1990. The fluid animation looked great, but was very difficult to code, and after a year of development with little progress, DMA Design decided to cancel the project. With the Amiga demo being shown at the computer show, we can hope one day a Mega Drive prototype will appear, or maybe the Amiga demo, but for now, no prototypes have been found. B-Bomb is an unreleased action game for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being developed by Sega Technical Institute in 1992, and planned to be published and released in early 1993 by Sega of America. B-Bomb gameplay is described as using your character's butt to smash enemies, short and sweet. B-Bomb was also shown at Summer CES 1993 and advertised in a couple magazines, but that's about it. Apparently there were 5 stages in total and a planned 2-player mode, which was never finished. We're not sure what went wrong, but something did, and B-Bomb was cancelled. No prototype has been found. Dr. Franken is an unreleased action platformer for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being developed by Eden Entertainment Software around early 1993, and to be published and released by Codemasters late in the same year. Dr. Franken was released for the SNES in 1993, but the Mega Drive, Game Gear, and Master System ports were all cancelled. The Game Gear version does have a demo of the game that was leaked online in 2011, while the other 2 versions have not been seen. There isn't a whole lot of gameplay in the Game Gear demo, but it didn't look terrible from what I saw. We can be hopeful, but for now, no prototype has been found. Cybernauts: The Next Breed is an unreleased futuristic fighting game being developed and published for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive by Accolade in 1994. The project went through 2 name changes before settling on Cybernauts: The Next Breed, and it was heavily marketed in several gaming magazines around this time. The game would have featured genetically enhanced human fighters fighting for good and evil. In 2019, the CEO of Pico Interactive got his hands on an alpha prototype copy of Cybernauts: The Next Breed and had a plan to release the game alongside a comic book tie-in via a Kickstarter campaign. The campaign fell short by a couple grand of its $3,500 goal, and neither the prototype or comic came out because of it. After the failed campaign, the owner of the prototype had this to say: "Thank you to all of our backers. We really appreciate you put time to review and pledge to our campaign. We will go in another direction than Kickstarter and release the comic book on our upcoming website and outlets like Comixology. We're in talks with publishers for physical version. In regards of the OST and the ROMs, we may reuse an OST in the future if we decide to fund a new game ourselves, and the ROMs we will try to partner with someone to make a video and a release." And that's the story so far on Cybernauts: The Next Breed. Stay tuned, as it's likely we'll see a prototype eventually. Mina in Wonderland is an unreleased minigames collection for the Sega Mega Drive, being developed by Micronet in 1994 and planned to be released in the same year. During gameplay, you would move your character around a city map with many buildings. Each building has a different minigame to play, with fan favorites like Chicken Race against a Masked Man. There was also a story mode featuring Mina and her pet. A prototype of the game was found and sold on Yahoo Auction years ago, but the ROM is yet to be dumped. Mina in Wonderland seems like it would have been a Japanese Mega Drive exclusive and was shown off in a couple Japanese gaming magazines in 1994, but without the prototype being dumped, this is all of the info we've uncovered for now. Slicks is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive isometric racing game being developed and published by Codemasters in 1994. Slicks had previously been released for the Commodore 64 and was supposed to be ported to the ZX Spectrum, Amiga, and Mega Drive, but none of those versions ever came out. There's plenty of advertising for the Amiga version, but only 2 ads have been found for the Mega Drive version. Gameplay was simple but smooth, featuring 8 levels and 10 playable tracks overall. Weather conditions and vehicle upgrades would affect gameplay, but that's about it. No prototype of Slicks has been found. Power Pigs of the Dark Age is an unreleased hack-and-slash platformer for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, being published by Titus in 1996. A SNES version of the game did come out in 1996, receiving decent reviews, and by the looks of the screenshots and above-average reviews of the Mega Drive version, it seems like it would have been a solid game overall. The graphics have a unique cartoon style and look great overall, but without any footage, it's hard to judge how the game would have played exactly. Although it's been reported that Power Pigs of the Dark Age for the Sega Mega Drive was completely finished, we're unsure why it was cancelled, and no prototype has been found. Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City, also known as Michael Jordan the Mad Professor Showdown, earlier on in development, is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game. It's an action platformer featuring NBA star Michael Jordan, who must save his friends from a mad scientist. The game came out on the SNES in November of 1994, and the Mega Drive version was being developed by Foley High-Tech and set to be published by EA in 1994 as well. Both the Sega Mega Drive and Game Gear versions were in development, and both were cancelled for unknown reasons. Usually this is where I say no prototype has been found, but an Assembler Games forum user posted this picture of a boxed copy of Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City on the Sega Mega Drive on November 24th, 2010. So we know one exists, but for now, no ROM has been dumped. Impossible Mission 2025 is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game that began development in 1993 by Microprose and set to be published by the same company in 1994. This project was to be an enhanced version of Impossible Mission 2025 for the Amiga computer, featuring 3 playable characters, collectible power-ups, different minigames, and new end-of-level bosses and cutscenes. During an interview, Stuart White, the producer of the game, is quoted as saying, "Although completed, Microprose could not afford the prices to get the cartridges manufactured, and so it was decided not to release either of them. I didn't mention it previously, but Microprose was developing a Super Nintendo version of Impossible Mission 2025 alongside the Mega Drive version, and although we know both of these are complete, no prototype has been found." Indiana Jones Greatest Adventures is an unreleased action platformer being developed for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive in 1995 by Factor 5 and LucasArts. The game was set to be published by US Gold in June of 1995, and it was a port of the Super Nintendo game of the same name that came out the previous year. The player would guide Indiana Jones through 28 stages, mostly based on events that happened in the movies. The reason Indiana Jones Greatest Adventures never came out, although it was complete and reviewed by a handful of gaming magazines, is due to US Gold filing for bankruptcy. This left LucasArts with no way to fund the game, and the project was never released. However, in 2017, a prototype version of Indiana Jones Greatest Adventure for the Sega Mega Drive sold on eBay, and that's the footage you can see on the screen now. Had this game have come out on the Sega Mega Drive, I think it would have been a solid addition to the overall library and possibly one of the better action platformers. The ROM for this project has not been dumped yet. Brett Hall Hockey is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive game being developed by Radical Entertainment in 1993 and set to be published by Accolade later in the same year. Brett Hall Hockey did come out on the SNES using Mode 7 graphics, and the Mega Drive version would have been a port of this game. It seems like the developers struggled to use the Mode 7 technology on the Mega Drive, but it's not clearly stated. However, when Brett Hall Hockey 95 came out on the Genesis in 1994 with an isometric view and nothing spectacular graphics-wise, we can assume that this may have been the case. Brett Hall Hockey was cancelled for unknown reasons, and no prototype has been found. Pinky is an unreleased platformer for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive being published by Tengen in 1994. Not sure who the developer would have been, but the original Pinky on Amiga was developed by Data Design Systems. Pinky is from Planet Purple, and he's on a mission to collect the last remaining dinosaur eggs in the universe. Both a Game Gear and SNES version of Pinky were also planned, and it seems a prototype of the SNES version has been uploaded online. No sign of the Game Gear or Mega Drive prototype cartridges yet. Socks the Cat Rocks the House is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive platformer being published by Kaneko in 1993 with no known developer. During gameplay, you control Socks the Cat, and your goal is to make your way around spies, crooked politicians, and the media in order to warn the White House of a stolen nuke. Socks the Cat was the pet of then President Bill Clinton, and a SNES version of this project was also in the works. The SNES version was purchased by a collector back in 2018, and with the help of a successful Kickstarter campaign, the SNES ROM has been dumped and preserved online. Socks the Cat Rocks the House was due for a November 1993 release, before being pushed back a couple times and ultimately cancelled. No prototype for the Sega Mega Drive version has been found. Speed Racer is an unreleased Sega Genesis and Mega Drive racing game being developed and published by Accolade in December of 1993. The full title of the project is Speed Racer in the Challenge of Racer X, and it's based on the franchise of the same name. Accolade released Speed Racer on the IBM PC in 1992, and the Mega Drive version was supposed to be very similar to the PC version, strictly a racing game at its core. There was a Super Nintendo version of the game that did come out in November 1994, but it's a completely different game than the original, with both racing and platforming during gameplay. Speed Racer on the Mega Drive was heavily advertised in several magazines throughout 1994, with its release date being pushed back several times before being cancelled. The reason for Speed Racer cancellation is unclear, and no prototype has been found. Snow White Happily Ever After. Soccer Kid. Al Unser Jr. Racing. Captain Dynamo. Mallrats. Shadow of Cerberus. Sporting News Soccer. The Mask. Troll Adventures. This entire Color Dreams pamphlet, including Andromeda Mission, Starblade, Colorado, Targon, Shadow of the Beast 3, Mario Lemieux Hockey 2, Sensible Golf, Outworld 2375 AD is a fitness racing game developed by Western Technologies and published by Heartbeat Corporation in 1993 for their Heartbeat Catalyst accessory for the Mega Drive. If you've heard about Heartbeat Corporation and their Heartbeat personal trainer console, you know anything made by these guys are some of the rarest video game items in the world due to such limited production of nearly all of the games and accessories they made. The Heartbeat Personal Trainer is a video game console with only 1,000 produced, and had a library of 4 games, including Outback Joey, the packing game with the console, PGA Tour Golf 2, NHL Hockey, and today's topic, Outworld 2375 AD. Now I know what you're thinking, why is Outworld 2375 AD on this list of unreleased games if it was technically released? Technically is the key word here because we're not 100% sure. From what we know, it was released, possibly. The game's own developer claims Outworld 2375 AD never made it to store shelves, however several collectors in the Lansing, Michigan area apparently own copies of the game. One owner even has a complete boxed copy with manual. The copies of the game are very crude and probably look similar to the version of PGA Tour Golf 2 for the Heartbeat Personal Trainer found a few years back. Why Lansing, Michigan, you ask? It seems that this was the main local hub that Catalyst Games distributed their product, and someone at Target managed to strike a deal with them. It's said that 3 Target stores in Lansing, Okemos, and Jackson, Michigan had copies of Outworld 2375 for sale, with no more than 300 copies of the game across all 3 stores in total. Finally, a prototype of the game was found and donated to the Video Game History Museum, but the ROM has yet to be dumped publicly. I'd love to explain how Outworld 2375 AD would have worked gameplay-wise with all of the sensors and exercise bike as your controller, but I want to save that for another video. There's so much information on this story of Outworld 2375 AD and the Heartbeat Personal Trainer, so I'll be doing a full video on these soon. Remember to scan old gaming magazines if you have them. You might have the information needed to uncover more unreleased games in the future. As always, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for a new video.